Fortunately, we have Bill Kelleher to talk about this because he knows a lot about this subject and knows a lot about politics in general. He got his Ph.D. from the University of California at Santa Barbara in 1984 and is the author of 2 books about American politics. One is called The New Election Game, which discussed the history of the presidential election reform and expanded on Buckminster Fuller's idea of voting from home by telephone, which of course now has been translated into using computers. He also wrote something called Progressive Logic, which discusses the principles and methods used by American progressives to criticize government policies, practices, and laws. He's currently working on a book on internet voting. Please welcome Dr. Bill Kelleher.
Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
For about 4 years, I've been a member of the audience, looking up at the speaker on the stage, and sometimes asking tough questions. So today is my first opportunity to be looking down on the audience and worrying about what kind of tough questions I might get. To start with, I will try to give you some idea of what internet voting is. Of course, it's the using your PC, and it can also be done with the cell phone. So the internet voting is convenient for people who are far away from polling places. And it's especially had its start as a way to make voting more convenient for overseas Americans. And in 2000, the Department of Defense had a small voting online program for some volunteers in the military overseas to test the methods. And the vote was successful. There weren't any problems. And so they decided to expand the operation. And in 2004, the plan was to have a internet voting project for 100,000 overseas voters, mostly military personnel. But there's estimates are that there are 6 million Americans abroad working in various occupations, and half of those, or not half of those, but a couple 100,000 military people, including their families, and who are eligible to vote. But they've had difficulties with that because every state and counties have their own requirements for absentee voting. And sometimes they're not very good at sending out absentee voting materials. One study showed that even in 2009, as many as 26 states sent out their absentee voting materials to people overseas so late that by the time the voters overseas received their materials, it was too late to mail them back and have their votes counted. So it's been frustrating for overseas voters. So in 2004, the Department of Defense had a program called SERVE, the Secure Electronic Registration, let's see now. Yeah, voting experiment. Secure Electronic Registration and Voting Experiment. And they had a secure server in Virginia that would post a website, and people overseas could log on to the website. They had passwords and personal information to verify their identities, and they were going to vote on the website. The people who were conducting the project were so convinced that this was going to work and work well that they invited some known anti-internet voting computer scientists to come and inspect the system. And they anticipated that these people would be converted and that they would endorse the internet voting plan. But it didn't work out that way. Four of the computer scientists, after the second meeting, decided that this was going to be a catastrophe if they held internet voting, that it could be hacked easily, that the word would get out, that the election wasn't legitimate, and there'd be a crisis of confidence among the voters. And they took their story to the New York Times, and the New York Times ran the story, and then it went in all the newspapers and all over the net. And the Undersecretary of Defense at the time was Paul Wolfowitz, and he ordered that the project be stopped. So the first big experiment with internet voting in the U.S. Was stopped before it really had a chance. There have been other experiments with internet voting in the U.S. Prior to that. I mentioned the one that the Department of Defense had. Also, the Republican Party had a internet voting experiment for its caucuses in Alaska. And if you want more details on that, you can ask Sarah Palin about it. And the Democratic Party had an experiment with internet voting for its primaries in the year 2000. And later in 2004, the Democratic Party had another experiment in Michigan. And all these trials were considered successful, and there weren't any technological or unlawful problems. But the idea of internet voting to help overseas voters flopped, and so that problem continued. And pressure was building in Congress to help these people out, and people were saying, you know, we can send emails all over the place and bank online and buy books online, and why can't we vote online instead of voting by snail mail? So in 2009, President Obama signed the MOVE Act, and that's the Military and Overseas Voting Empowerment Act. And Congress, again, allocated money and set up the requirements for another electronic voting experiment. This time, the law required that states send their absentee voting materials to people overseas at least 45 days before the election. It just so happens that September 15th was the 45th day before the, I think it's November 2nd, the election. And if they couldn't meet that deadline, then they would have to try and send the materials out electronically. So 33 states have set up systems to send out their absentee voting materials electronically. And people overseas can send an email to the local election official and request the absentee ballot, and the absentee ballot will be sent by fax or email. And then the voter can fill out the ballot and either fax it back or send it as an email attachment. And with this process, a voter can request the materials, receive them, vote, and send them back all on election day, which is a lot more convenient than the paper-based system that prevails right now. So the idea of voting on a website is also being tried in Washington, D.C. and in West Virginia, where there have been some, they've tried it in the primaries in West Virginia, and the Secretary of State in West Virginia is really excited about it, and the voters really liked it a lot, and they want to expand that idea of voting on a website from wherever you are. You can vote from wherever you are, and anytime you want to vote, in your pajamas if you want to. You can't do that with the polling places or paper-based voting. So there's movement. There was the great idea in 2004, and that went down. But there's been movement more towards electronic voting, and so in 2010 we're going to see what happens with these states operating electronically. One of the problems is that if you want to vote by fax or email, you have to sign a privacy waiver. That's a requirement in the state of California and in several other states, because your vote is going to have your identity on it. When you send by email, your identity is exposed, and so if somebody in the election official's office finds out that you voted for a communist and they tell the local newspaper, you might be in a position to sue the government for violating your privacy. If you sign a privacy waiver, the government protects itself. So that's a great disadvantage for this form of voting, and that wouldn't be a problem with voting on a website-based system. I talked just last week with a guy named Bob Carey, and he's the administrator for the agency that has jurisdiction over the internet voting for military people. It's called the Federal Voting Assistance Program. It's part of the Department of Defense. And he told me that the decision has been made to restore the SERV project with all the updates that have come along since 2004 for technological operations and security. But it's been difficult coordinating their work with the other agencies that are involved. There's the EAC, which is the Election Assistance Commission, and they have jurisdiction over voting technology, and they have to approve plans for voting technology. So there's federal agencies now that are working on this, and the hope is that sometime soon internet voting will be approved, internet voting based on website voting, where you log on to a website and the ballot comes up on your computer screen and you vote it there, and then you click a button and you send out your vote. I'll talk about the security issues involved in that process in just a minute.